Well, welcome. This panel is on the cost of innovation, complexity of software regulation. We're going to talk, I got to get my little cue guy here, and go through some of the issues related to software regulation. We're seeing a lot more focus on regulating software and taking some of the balance away from users and enterprises and putting it more on software manufacturers. And it's a worldwide effort that we've seen in this space, but really we're focusing mostly on the US here. We can talk a little bit about some of the global pieces as it comes up. We have a great panel: Mickey Breslin, CEO of Sempris, Sam Curry, who is the global
VP and CISO.
Yeah. CISO for Zscaler, and then Nick Listerson from who's Assistant Director at the Office of the National Cyber Director for the White House, and Nick's going to go first because he has some news today. We didn't think we'd be breaking news in this particular panel.
Well, one of us did, I think. One had an idea.
But they put out this morning the new implementation plan for the national strategy, and what I forget what they call it, but it's basically the progress report.
Posture.
The posture report that goes along with the implementation of the strategy, and Nick is in charge of both of those things. So just focusing on the issue at hand, what does the implementation plan say about the, software liability issues and that part of the strategy?
Great.
I guess what does the strategy say about it?
Thanks, Ari. So we released this morning the posture report for 2023. So it's a report on what the cybersecurity posture of the United States looks like in 2023. This is the first annual report that we're providing. We're a new office in the White House. We've existed for just under 3 years at this point. And with that is the second version of our National Cybersecurity Strategy Implementation Plan. So we released our first in July. We said this is an iterative document. The strategy is a long-term document that looks out over the next decade. Implementation, though, we got to do in discretized chunks. So we had 69 initiatives in the first plan. We've now got 31 new ones, and one of them is related to software liability and how we're thinking about regulating software. So what the strategy says, right, fundamentally is we need to, as Ari said, shift some of the responsibility for cybersecurity to the more capable actors in the ecosystem. And that's strategic shift number one. The second strategic shift says we need to do a better job of incentivizing investment in cybersecurity and resilience. And of the 27 strategic objectives in the strategy, none really encapsulates those two shifts more than the idea of exploring a software liability regime. So what the strategy says is we, the United States government, are going to work with our partners in Congress and explore different frameworks for using software liability or liability related to vulnerabilities in software to incentivize more investments in secure development, because that is the focus. We are not doing liability for liability's sake. That's not anyone's interest. What we're saying is right now there's an ability for software manufacturers to externalize some of the costs of insecure development practices on their users. We're trying to make sure that, in fact, if users are getting breached because of vulnerabilities in software products, some of the costs that they're experiencing get shifted back to the root cause. We like this for a whole bunch of reasons that I'm happy to get into, but just in terms of what it means from the implementation plan, in the first version of the implementation plan, we said we're going to go out and we're going to talk to law professors, computer science professors, people in the academic community, because this has been a problem that's been studied off and on for more than 3 decades, to get a sense of what the frameworks are, legal frameworks are that are out there. And in the second version of the implementation plan released this morning, we say, great, now we're actually going to take that to industry and talk to software manufacturers. Just last month, I did 2 roundtables with software manufacturers to say, hey, here's how we're sort of thinking about these challenges. These are the frameworks that we're using as straw men of this is how we're sort of thinking about the problem. Give us feedback on how this would, if one of these regimes took place, they would influence your development practices. Because again, that's really the end goal that we're trying to do. And what we're going to do over the next 8 to 10 months is continue to outreach to industry, and then eventually, so first software manufacturers, eventually consumer advocates, and folks in critical infrastructure industries, people who are users of software, to see how we can actually design a framework that will have the incentivizing effects that we're going after without having a lot of ancillary problematic effects. So that's kind of what the implementation plan says for the next iteration of work on this topic. And I think the last point I'll make, Ari, is, this is a long-term project, right? This is something that has been discussed in the academic literature, again, for 35 plus years, but there hasn't been really a sustained policy effort on it. And we are doing that sustained policy effort, which also means it's going to take time, and we're very content with that because it is a big deal. It will hopefully cause significant shifts in the way people develop software, a positive direction, and it deserves time to make sure that we can get it right before we drop it on anyone.
Great. Thanks. I just wanted to briefly go through, look, they added this slide, which I didn't have.
Look at that.
And now you know who's who from that slide. Or maybe we'll come back to that. But I did want to come to some of these. So these are the resources for the conference if you're looking for them later, or you can take pictures of them. But here's some of the existing laws that we're seeing. One key one that we're going to get into a little bit is the Secure Attestation Common Form that we saw CISA put out earlier this year. It came out of this memo. We're seeing similar things from the UK. And then the EU put out the Cyber Resilience Act, which in a lot of the politicians' discussion about of how the Cyber Resilience Act works, focuses on Internet of Things, but in reality covers a lot of software as well. Covers most enterprise software pretty clearly, and a lot of consumer software. Well, most consumer software and a lot of enterprise software as well, probably a better way to put it. And then we also are seeing a lot of guidance and voluntary efforts in this space as well. And so that's another area to focus on. And one I don't have here, because it was under embargo, or at least I was under embargo talking about it, was the Secure by Design pledge that CISA is putting out tomorrow afternoon here, but has now come out from under embargo. So we can talk about that as well if we want to. So from there, we have these kind of broad session takeaways that I'll leave up, but I wanted to go to Mickey and talk about, how are these different guidance and some of the efforts that Nick has talked about impacting, how are they impacting software manufacturers, and how are they impacting the and how is that those changes impacting the users of the software?
Yeah, it's a great thing that you guys are doing. I think regulations in general are created in order to regulate something which is getting out of balance. That's typically when you'll see regulations coming in. I want to hope and think that many of the manufacturing software companies have already been tackling the challenge and we're not waiting for the government to come in and solve it for them. I do highly appreciate the fact that as Nick mentioned, they're having conversations with the manufacturing companies in order to make sure that what is being created is created in the spirit that can work for everybody, which I think is a critical point. The second point from my perspective is what we're trying to achieve, which is the cyber resiliency. That's eventually the goal of this whole operation. Mm-hmm. And I look at it as two different types of insecurity in systems that you potentially can find. One is indeed with the manufacturer directly. So if somebody is shipping a software that is full of vulnerabilities that can be used by a bad actor, that's on the manufacturer. I'm thinking about it kind of as a car analogy. If you have a car and the brakes don't work, it's clearly the manufacturer issue. The second part of it, in my perspective, for the cyber resiliency part, have to do with the user himself, or how the software that is being used is configured. Because you can take the most secure software but open it up completely, and that will also be abused. The analogy that I like there, again going back to the car example, is imagine that you have a car and you don't use the seatbelt. That's clearly a user issue. This would not be with the manufacturer. And I think the combination of those two, so basically what part will be responsible from the manufacturer perspective, what part should be responsible on the user perspective, or potentially by usage of third parties in order to help and configure the system in a secure way. I believe that the combination of those two should get us to a desired state of cyber resiliency. And I hope that the regulations that are coming out now will make it more clear, or put a path into where we're trying to get to eventually.
Sam, how about you? Do you agree, and what are you seeing?
Yeah, to a point. I want to make a couple of comments, foundational ones, but I want to also talk about what both Nick and Mickey have said. So first of all, Nick, I think it's a really good thing that this is not, it's a done thing, it's a rolling thing, right? That it's an ongoing process. So the two foundational principles, one is that I think while we have lots of technical problems, the biggest problem in cybersecurity is lack of alignment between cyber functions and business generally. In other words, there's this gap. No matter how well we align, we tend to drift apart over time. And so this is a burden, right? What is the impact on a P&L? What is the impact on cost? What are the risk trade-offs? There's a reason people don't rush to put out patches. It's because the chance of a business impact from putting a patch out too fast is much higher than the risk of an exploitation. And people don't talk about that. And so we've got to solve that problem, and we've got to make it more of a business conversation. And that's not a problem on the business side, it's an all of the organization type of conversation. The second thing, and where I think it's different from your car analogy, Mickey, is that there's an active opponent here. And something between 1 and maybe 3-4% of vulnerabilities will be discovered. There seems to be a sense, like with the bridge or with the car, that there is a perfect bridge to make within certain tolerances. And that software would work that way if we could just make people build it that way. And we should encourage innovation to patch better and better quality, and we should encourage to have secure by design or private by design, for instance. But when you have an active opponent, that's second order chaos system, not a first order chaos system. It's not nature that's the enemy. It's not, let's say, for instance, hurricanes in the meteorological system, right? When you actually, when you take shelter from the hurricane, it doesn't change course to attack you, but that's exactly what happens online. And so when you build stronger software, those other 97 to 99% of vulnerabilities not discovered are in fact the ones that they then turn their attention to. And so it's not like I could just make better software with no vulnerabilities. Now, could you make better software with less? Could you use better programming language with better memory protection? Sure. Could you release things with higher quality? Yes, but we've got to get away from thinking, boy, you build something with a vulnerability and there's something inherently wrong with you. That thinking has to stop, and we have to start thinking, the term you used, Mickey, I really liked, was resilience. We've got to be more resilient, generally speaking, and that's a big challenge. And while I think we're talking to big companies with processes, they typically don't innovate well because the opponent is innovating very quickly. And they don't have the same strictures or constraints on how they behave. And one of the reasons this industry doesn't commoditize like others, and what commodity is something available everywhere, same quality from everywhere, and then it tends to consolidate. And then price is the only differentiator. The reason that you have thousands of companies on the show floor after this show has been here nearly 40 years, right? That didn't happen in ERP, right? That didn't happen in CRM, but it happens in cybersecurity because the opponent makes us innovate, which means it has to be a high rate of innovation. That's why there's all those startups on the fringe of the show floor. And they can't afford the same constraints. They don't have the same wherewithal or ability to have the same kind. So we've got to figure that problem out, right? What Wendy Mather used to call the security poverty line also applies to the vendors on that show floor and to everybody who's manufacturing software outside of cybersecurity. So there's a ton to unpack.
Actually, let's come back to that because I think that's the where we want to go. I wanted to go back a slide here and talk about the government versus private sector side. So we had the voluntary stuff up there before, which most of it applies to both private sector and government, but then now in the U.S. there's a much bigger focus on the regulatory side, at least, or at least administrative action side of having government agencies care about secure by design and demonstrate secure by design. Can you just go into why the focus on government agencies over private sector and where you see the impact of that happening?
Yeah, so let me just react quickly to Sam's points, and then I'm happy to talk about how we're sort of effectuating some changes now. First of all, as a lapsed and not very good software engineer, completely understand the point and am very sensitive to the fact that we are not in the White House right now at all talking about a strict liability regime where any vulnerability under any circumstance, there's liability for that, and that's because I love the nature analogy. It's one I use all the time when I'm talking to folks who aren't software engineers to say, these are some of the challenges, these are why standards won't save you, because Mother Nature is a hell of an enemy, but she's not actually actively trying to kill you. Right. So I think it's very important that we're kind of clear on that point, that what we're looking to do is, again, incentivize more investment in secure development practices and say, hey, actually we do know how to deal with a lot of memory safety issues. We have a way to do that. What we don't have is a business case to make for that. To say, hey, refactor your code base, and you look and say, well, yeah, that would probably help a lot of my customers, right? It would significantly enhance their security if we were able to take this legacy code that if we were writing today, there's no way we would write in C, we would write it in Rust. But it's got 100 million lines and it's spread across a whole bunch of different packages, and it sounds like a really hard and expensive proposition to go fix that. So we know there's a solution out there, we know it's applicable, we know that we could do it, but when you try and make the business case, it's like, who does this really benefit the most? Well, it benefits our users, but it's unclear how we're going to get any direct ROI to our P&L for that, right? And that's the incentive structure that we look and say, okay, so this is costing users money, but there's not really a direct way from a business market perspective right now that a software manufacturer would be able to say, oh, that's a wise investment. That's fundamentally, right, the market failure we're trying to correct. If you look at then, what are we doing right now and where do things stand at the moment? There is a focus right now in government procurement and saying, hey, this is something that we have a fair bit of control over, right? As the United States government, we purchase a lot of stuff. Software is one of the stuff that we purchase. And we can set conditions of what do we expect from the stuff that we buy. So one of the first actions in this administration on cybersecurity was an executive order protecting the nation's cybersecurity, very, very creatively named 14028 if you are in the DC crowd and need to number everything. And it has a section, Ari's nodding along, yes. It has a section,
acronyms and numbers,
4,
definitely.
Right, that says, hey, this is kind of what our expectations are going to be going forward for software that we're purchasing. And so implementation of that has been ongoing for the past 3 years, almost. The EO turns 3 in a week. And essentially says, here is, at the moment, we're using a self-attestation process. CISA has put out a form that we're going to right now require by policy, eventually require by regulation, to be included in contracts for folks that are buying software from the private sector that says you need to attest as part of the package that you're providing to the United States government, you need to attest that you've done some secure development practices, right? You need to have a committing official for your company sign off at the bottom of this form that says, yes, we have these particular practices that we use in our software development processes. So that's in progress, I would say, right? So the forum has been live for about a month and a half at this point or so. We expect there to be, on the regulatory front, a federal acquisition regulation, a FAR rule that will be coming out in the near future that also will say this is how to include language related to the attestation form in all federal contracts for software going forward. We really do hope that this will help the entire ecosystem, because we'll see people saying, yeah, we don't want to develop our own forked version of whatever the software product we're selling is just for the federal government. So we'll see people say, okay, well, I better make sure I'm at least doing these processes so I can keep selling to the government. But from an incentive standpoint, we think that'll get us part of the way there, but probably not as far as we need to get. And that's really where a broader liability regime comes in, and why we're sort of looking at that as additional incentives.
But in this specific case, let's put Mickey and Sam the piece to the test here, which is, do we feel as though this is going to be effective, right? I mean, you said partially effective, and what do we think the impact is going to be on innovation? Will it make it even harder for small companies to sell to government, which is already very difficult, small software?
Mickey, you want to go first?
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So just some background so you understand the perspective that I have. Sempris is a company that grows very, very fast. So to give you some sense, back in January of 2020, the company was about 30 people. January of 2024, the company is 400 and something people. So I kind of have this perspective of being a small startup and then maturing into a more mature type of a company. I think from the perspective of how secure is your software and the speed of innovation, to Sam's point from before, the bad actors are evolving very fast. And it kind of makes sense that you will see innovation coming from the smaller startups, because they're responding to certain things that big actors just cannot do as fast as you can do when you are a small startup. With that said, I do think that there need to be some sort of responsibility on the startup as well, to make sure that what they're doing is not going to eventually harm their customer because the software that they provided was actually insecure, which creates kind of a challenging situations for all sides. And I think it also very much depends on how that software is being provided. Is it a SaaS offering? Is it deployed on-prem? What other potential security compensation measures do you have in place to compensate for whatever might be missing? I think, from my experience at least, we made a decision not to work with the government at the initial stages of the company, just because we knew what it will take, not because of the software being insecure. We knew what it will take in terms of going through the process of actually being adopted by the government. And it's not a secret that the big manufacturer software companies typically provide the government with one version lower than what they already have in the market, because of the certification process that they need to go with the government. So to some degree, it creates, I think, from the government perspective, an interesting dilemma, because you don't benefit from the innovation that is happening kind of in real time with the smaller players or even with some of the bigger ones. On the second side of it, I mean, the benefit for you is you're probably getting the most mature version that you can get at the time that you're adopting it. So it's kind of have its pros and cons.
Yeah, I'm going to add to that a bit. Just doing the math. So I was the chief product officer, chief security officer for a startup. I've been a CISO like 5 times and a CTO 4. But when I was in that small company, it took 6 security people dedicated to maturing the organization and 3 people dedicated to documenting it, which in your case would have probably been between 20 and 30% of your manpower as an additional surtax. 2 years to get to the maturity level you could sell to the federal government, or to various levels of government. And that's an unsupportable tax. And so the government would say, well, then you can't sell to us. And we would say, okay, we're not going to. And we didn't for 7 years. And that was when we actually created a federal subsidiary to undertake that, when we had enough in our main corporate group to get to that level of maturity that we could then undertake that. And that's a problem. But think of it the other way. When you have that one version older that you're selling to the government, you're selling it at a premium because of the cost to maintain it, it's more difficult to staff, and it is slower to innovate. So now we're talking about that being the case more broadly. That would become the norm for the commercial sector. So maybe that'll be an incentive for innovation. But we have a bad habit in cybersecurity of thinking in terms of absolutes. Things are either secure or they're not. And that notion of partial that you mentioned, Ari, that has benefits. So if you can make it a little more secure, that actually has a big effect at scale. And innovation that can make slightly better trade-offs is actually worth doing. So I think what we want to do is to change the equation a little bit, and that can have a profound impact. But the other thing I want to say is on the practitioner side, right? So speaking as a CISO, I don't have many resources as a CISO that are dedicated to the innovation of the tools that I use. Now, it's different. I work for a cybersecurity vendor, but I'm speaking generally. That CISOs have a SOC and an IR team. They have a GRC team. They have an InfoSec Classic team. They've got DevSecOps, perhaps. But how many people in the room have even heard of a yellow team? Red teams and blue teams, we know. That's engineering and DevOps dedicated, SecDevOps. The place we get it is from the vendors in the community. I'm lucky I work for a cyber vendor. But the resources in the attacker are 100% dedicated to innovation in attack. So there's not just the asymmetry in cyber conflict. And so we've got to figure out how do we actually make more effective use of resources in defense and a greater percentage for that, as opposed to tying up more of them with justification for how we secure the environment. And that concerns me too.
So I mean, one thing about the attestation form, it's a good example of taking something broader, taking SSDF and kind of saying we're going to focus on these areas, but still have a risk management feel to it the way SSDF originally did. Is that a workable system for getting to what you're getting to more security in the space, or are there?
You mean spending time on the risk management side and prioritizing and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean
Having a rigor to it.
This is the government making those decisions. Can businesses do that themselves? Can we put it into regulation?
I'm going to say yes, but I think that what we don't have yet is what is a pound of security and what are the standards in the space, and I think maybe that'll come from some of these initiatives. Because at some point in the future, and Nick, if you disagree, please say it, but I think if we look 5 years down the road and part of your long-term strategy, we're going to eventually be faced with somebody with a liability charge, and they're going to say, were you in the right mindset? Did you do the right things? And what does normal look like? With a moving target. And so, I think we have standards in the medical practice. I'm not a medical practitioner. And in other spaces like this. So those don't really exist for us, right? So what's a baseline good security look like? And that's a hard thing to gauge because verticals are different, sizes of companies are different, geographies are different. But we've got to sort of get to that, especially when we're going to start to see tremendous innovation in terms of which avenues of attack there'll be. We're already seeing vulnerabilities now emerge in places we didn't expect because there's new avenues of attack that are coming due to innovation.
Yeah, and I think, right, there's several points that have kind of been teased out of why this is a hard policy problem that has kind of existed mostly in the academic realm for 35 years. So one of them is exactly what does a standard of care look like, right? And is a standard of care predicated on processes that a software developer uses, because we understand that writing perfectly secure code is not something that we know how to do? Is it a property of the product where we say, okay, but this class of vulnerabilities or these types of known vulnerabilities or whatever it may be, that's where liability attaches? That's a great question. Another great question that was kind of alluded to earlier by Mickey is how do we apportion liability? So, okay, there was a vulnerable product, but a patch has existed. All right, it was exploited 1 hour after the patch came out. Probably still mostly on the vendor side that you didn't deploy your patch in 1 hour. It doesn't sound a lot like user error. The patch is 2 years old. Okay, yeah, but for, the vulnerability probably still wouldn't have been exploited, but if you've been sitting on it for 2 years, that starts to look a lot more like
that's more on the operator's problem. So that's more the operator's fault, right? And when you say, how much should they be able to recover from a software vendor that they ignored any sort of updates for 2 years? It's like, probably not that much. But these are some of the policy questions that we're trying to work through. And Ari, to your point on how much does this, does the self-attestation, like how will this incentivize folks? We want to know, right? Like, we think the thesis from the government is this will make a difference, right? You will have a bunch of seniors in companies that are looking at this and saying, you know, we need to attest to this. We can lose our contract if it turns out we're not living up to it. And the Justice Department might say, hey, you've committed some sort of fraud. You've defrauded the government in some way if you signed off on the form without doing your due diligence of do our practices actually live up to what we're attesting to the United States government. Our hope is that will incentivize more secure development practices. That's our thesis. Makes sense to me, but we got to see how it plays out. And again, to the point of it being partial, like, I don't think that's going to get us all of the way that we want to go.
Yeah, just to maybe give
Just
two
real quick,
examples.
but I'll let you finish. But we want to make sure that we have time to let people ask questions. So, especially you got here at 8:30. That means you're like a motivated group. So I do expect some questions from you guys. So you can line up with these two microphones. But Mickey, you go ahead while they're doing that.
Yeah, so one of the point that I'm wanting to make is, as an example, we have third parties that we use in order to scan the code to make sure that what we are providing is secure. The interesting part for me is that we have some customers that will explicitly ask about it. Who was doing the pen testing? What are the software that you're using? What are the things that you have in place in order to make sure that the code is not vulnerable? What is interesting to me is actually the customers that are not asking. And my hope is that the regulation that will come in place at least will help organizations on the customer side to think what are the things that we should be asking from the manufacturer. Because it's puzzling me where some of the customers are very well aware and they're specifically asking about the security controls that you have in place. There's still a vast majority there that doesn't ask about it. And if we want to incentivize the manufacturers to do better in terms of making sure that the software that they're providing is indeed secure, it kind of makes sense that we should create the demand on the customer side to demand it. We want, as a customer, to make sure that the software that we're using is secure to the highest level that can be achieved.
There's a customer demand, and there's also public good, because it's actually better for the environment on the internet the more secure
100%.
people are. But I think we have some questions.
Go ahead.
Hey, good morning, thank you. My name's Michael, and I'm an architect with CyberArk, so I talk to a lot of regulated industries, and I see them do a lot of stuff because of regulation, but over the last few years, cyber insurance is what has actually made like real concrete gains just across the board in every company that I talk to. And so, you know, that's one of those things that I wonder if there's a way to, instead of having kind of more and more checks on companies, as a way to upstream that, and for example, standardize and normalize on what cyber insurance is. I was at a talk yesterday that was the art of cyber insurance, and they were like, it can be anything, you know, and that's something that I see actually, you know, creating security and resilience. Is that something that we can, you know, regulate and require, or at least what it needs to cover, you know, as an incentive builder?
So I have strong feelings on this one, but I'll let
You should say something.
Go ahead.
I mean, this is something that I worked on when I was in government, and insurance is a very reactive business, and it's always going to be behind. I mean, it took fire insurance like basically 100 years to get to the point where it was actually like building up stronger risk management skills and building codes where people actually did stuff. So, you know, I don't think it will take as long in cybersecurity, but 10 years later, we're at the point where it's starting to have an impact that you're seeing, right? So, and that's a good thing, but now we're moving on to software, and I worry that you end up somewhere like 10 years from now, we see an impact with security, unless we get some of these other projects moving along. You start to see expectations of SSDF being used, and which the secure development framework being used for software, and then that then becomes tied into insurance, some of the insurance policies.
This ties into something that Mickey said, Michael, earlier. Regulations exist really because because practitioners weren't doing what they should have been doing. And it's painful. This happened with FFIEC, like way back in 2004 when they said, thou shalt do SIM. And there was a company called Network Intelligence. They made $30 million a year. They had $1 billion booking quarter because banks suddenly had to have SIM, right? And if you talk to actuaries in the cyber insurance industry, they're like, we're actually just asking for the basics. We're not even tying this to actuarial tables for the most part. That is now starting to get to that point. And you probably heard that in sessions. But like the basic blocking and tackling wasn't happening. And there's a carrot and stick here. Most of the requirements they were having, the 400 questionnaires and the 40 pages of exclusions, were to incent people to do the basics. And now they're getting to the point where they're actually starting to see some indications of what might be an indicator or predictor of loss and what might have an effect. And that's going to be an evolving thing. And so I think they've got to get closer to real time. To Ari's point, 100 years we don't have, right?
So a couple things I would say. So I would say as an administration, we're bullish on the ability of cyber insurance to help, right? To be one of the incentives that can drive better security in the marketplace. To that end, in the strategy, we say there's a particular emphasis on trying to remove some of the tail risk that insurers have from correlated incidents. That has been a perennial problem with cyber insurance in particular, is that we generally don't see 3 hurricanes at once, and we also really don't see the chances that there's a mudslide in California, a hurricane in Louisiana, and a huge series of tornadoes in Kansas. Those are not correlated risks. So it's not, they can't happen, but they're not correlated. When you've got a living, breathing adversary, it's like, oh yeah, no, the chance that all of these events happen at the same time might be a lot more correlated, and that hasn't driven as much capital into the cyber insurance market as one might hope. So there's a lot of conversation right now in the government about how do we potentially take off some of the tail risk so that insurers can say, all right, we'll bring capital in here and we're not going to have to take an extremely risk-averse view, because we know if something that we can't predict and we don't really understand yet does happen, we can still provide insurance. This is really an accelerant to what Ari's talking about. If we don't have the time, right, this is a way we hope to sort of accelerate that, rather than saying, oh, well, we need 50 years of claims data before we're convinced that there isn't so much of this correlate risk. That's really on the operational side, though, right? That's on users. How does this play into the software liability conversation? If you remove some of the liability disclaimers that exist on virtually every contract and license for software right now, we do think that insurers will be interested in that because insurers will be on the hook for, oh, you had some business interruption. Now we're paying a claim, we're reimbursing you, and we're like, hey, what's the root cause here? How did this happen? Oh, well, it was, potentially lax secure development processes at the manufacturer of one of your edge devices. An insurer is very well positioned to say, yeah, okay, that's the root cause. We've reimbursed you, the company that got breached, or back on your feet, but we can go back and say, hey, we have a vested interest in trying to, recover some of the damages that we're paying out, because actually the root cause here is a lack of sufficient secure development practices. So I think that's something we are very interested in.
One of the things in the strategy is the idea of federal backstop for that, so that has there been any discussion about, if there's a major software thing, if insurers, you will give the backstop to the insurance companies if software companies do X, Y, and Z in this case?
Yeah, one of the big questions, if you're going to have this backstop, if you're going to try and eliminate the tail risk by saying, hey, if claims reach this amount, or if it's an active, quote unquote, cyber war, whatever it may be, that the government is going to stand in, what are the conditions for participation in that program, right? How much of that is tied to purely insurance market related things? How much are maybe requirements that might exist? And we say, hey, we're not going to be your reinsurer unless you do X, Y, and Z in underwriting. And those are active conversations right now. And what does X, Y, and Z in underwriting mean? maybe it is you have some set of controls that you're using, but maybe it's also tied to software that the company that you're insuring practices that they do too. That right now we're very much first focused on the primary goal, which is to bring more liquidity into the cyber insurance market. But certainly, if you have a program that's doing that, any sort of cybersecurity requirements that might come with that is an open discussion we're having right now.
I think the cyber insurance industry and the cyber industry in general have a lot in common. We're both looking at risk. That's eventually kind of what this whole thing is about. And I think looking at what happened with the cyber insurance industry was fascinating over the last few years. Kind of the whole change from, at some point, I think many companies, and on both sides, the manufacturer of the software and the customers, kind of put the risk on the cyber insurance companies. So basically there was some assumption that if something goes wrong, well, we'll be paid by the cyber insurance company. And then at some point, the cyber insurance company said, well, actually, that's not going to work that way because it's going to become too expensive. So in some ways, it actually became helpful to the cyber creation, the manufacture of cyber software, because all of a sudden there was this understanding, no, we actually need to make sure that what we are creating and what we're using is going to make us secure, and it's not really reasonable to assume that the cyber insurance companies will just step in every time and pay the bill. It's not going to work that way. So I think it's very interesting and a very positive change from what we're seeing in the industry.
Last question, then we'll wrap up.
Hi. A couple of things on incentives. I see some sort of regulations that maybe you've not mentioned, like NIS2, coming in later this year, which puts a requirement on companies to actually do audits of their vendors, which might see enterprises purchase more like the federal government and be a lot more cautious and look for that sort of a standard of sort of best practice on their software. Otherwise, they'd carry the liability rather than their vendors if they haven't done that properly. And then secondly, also on incentives, at the moment I see some of the internet standards being developed where arguably they're becoming less secure because of privacy, so they're removing indicators of compromise from the standards. And I wonder if this sort of liability threat might drive the cyber companies to engage more in the internet standards development to ensure the standards are more secure, because at the moment this industry is not present in the development of internet standards with one or two very small exceptions. So I don't know what the panel might think on that.
Yeah, so a great point on this too, Dora as well, in both cases. I've advocated very strongly, certainly all the companies I've been in, for being part of those standards, and I actually put resources into that, but you're very right, we don't do enough of it as an industry. I also think we're going to have to shift and think more carefully about architecture, right? Conway's Law notwithstanding, that our organizations tend to reflect how our software is built. We have to start thinking about less trust, if not zero trust. How do we build software so there's less purchase, and demonstrably so? Because we're starting to see new technology and attack develop new avenues for breaching things. But I think what you're gonna see is that regulations generally copy each other, and later regulations happen faster. We saw it with GDPR going to other privacy regulations, for instance. And that's going to continue. If you look around the world, there are privacy regulations and data sovereignty laws happening everywhere in the wake of sort of the artificial intelligence craze. And it even stretches back to machine learning, which we've had for years and now people are suddenly aware of. So my suspicion is you're going to see waves of regulation until the problem's fundamentally solved. And seeing as it's an endemic one, we'd better get used to thinking about how we deal with this as a systemic thing. So I think NIS2, DORA, and the new regulations coming out in Canada, what's happening in places like China, these are going to be the new norm. India's got a new one coming out, for instance. If we don't get ready for that as something we have to be prepared for and get involved as an industry, then shame on us.
So what I would say is kind of two things. So first, a lot of, at least in the United States, three things. A lot of things in the United States when it comes to supply chain are focused much more on operational, like, hey, you have access to my data, you have access to my network, I want to know something operationally about that, less on what's the security of the products that you're purchasing or you're using in your environment. I think that the work under the executive order and the self-attestation form is sort of potentially a model of something that could be pushed down through critical infrastructure, but we're not there yet in the United States. The second point I would make is on the international front, and to the point of regulations are often copied. Part of the reason that we in the administration are having these conversations right now is because we want to get the incentives right? Like, we're not here, I keep saying it because it keeps being true. We're not here for liability's sake. We're not doing regulations because, oh, we just want to feel like we have some control over this. We want to incentivize more secure software development. That's why we're going through this process. That's why we're having a lot of conversations. That's why I'm here at RSA talking about it and getting input. All of which is to say, though, that right now this is not a conversation that we're hearing a lot of in Europe. I don't expect that to last very long. And from our perspective, right, it would be great to have something that we feel comfortable as an administration and as a US tech industry is a sensible approach to this, that we can say, this is a good way to actually get the outcome you want on cybersecurity incentives, and this is a model that one might use elsewhere across the world, and maybe rather than being reactive in the United States to happenings on in tech regulatory policy, we can be a bit proactive and set the agenda some.
Mickey, do you want the last word on this? One thing I'll say is we were asked to tell people the actions to take, and both Sam and Nick gave some actions in there, or things to think about action-wise, so you can do both, Mickey.
I think one great thing is of course the discussion between the public and private sector, where basically how things potentially can work, because I believe that we're all striving to the same result. It's just a matter of figuring out what is the right way to get there. The recommendation, kind of what I alluded to before, demand more from the manufacturers of the software. Make sure that you're asking the questions of how secure is the software that you're actually about to receive, because eventually it will affect how you operate in your day-to-day.
Great. Well, join me in thanking the panelists. Really great way to start the day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.